It's day 8 of Wilds of Eldraine spoilers, and today we get a look at the best bunny ever and a ton of rats. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Wilds of Eldraine spoilers. So we've reached the penultimate day of spoiler season. Today's the last actual day of spoilers, and then we get a little break tomorrow in the full set on Friday, but we still have some really sweet stuff to talk about. We got the red member of our enchantment adventure Mythic cycle, we got some ridiculous bunnies, lots of rat tokens, which means we should probably jump right into it. Start dogging spicy new cards. Before we do, some quick reminders. First, if you need any of these cards, you can grab them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Second, to keep up on all the latest spoilers throughout the day, you should head on over to MTGpreviews.com. Third, it's Commander Precon spoiler day today for Wilds of Eldraine, and Tomer's going to be covering the new Commander spoilers over on the MTGGoldfish Commander YouTube, so make sure to head over there and check out his video to see the spicy new Commander cards. Anyway, let's talk some Wilds of Eldraine. So first up today, we got a new Mythic in Virtue of Courage. So this is the red member of the Mythic Enchantment Adventure cycle, and I think this card is actually kind of bonkers. Honestly, I thought this card was really good when I first saw it, and the more I think about what this card does, the more excited I become for it. So it's spell side, 2 mana instant, 2 damage to any target, so 2 mana shock. Its enchantment side says whenever a source you control deals non-combat damage to an opponent, you may exile that many cards from the top of your library, and you may play those cards this turn. So early game damage / removal, late game an absurd source of card advantage, assuming your deck can deal non-combat damage. This kind of looks like Bonecrusher Giant. Bonecrusher Giant, same adventure mode. I know actually it stops damage from being prevented, but that's like a pretty fringe upside most of the time outside of One Ring situations. But it's essentially the same. 2 mana shock, which we saw in Bonecrusher, was a standard staple. One of the best cards in standard. Still sees a lot of play in Pioneer and Modern. So a 2 mana shock on an adventure has been very good in the past. I'm not saying Virtue of Courage is Bonecrusher good. I think a 3 mana 4/3 is better than a 5 mana enchantment, but the amount of card advantage Virtue of Courage can generate in the late game is actually kind of stunning. I couldn't find a really good comparison for the deal damage, exile that many cards, you can play them this turn. I guess the best I could come up with was Dream Pillager, and honestly that's not a very good one. It's really a pretty new mechanic. There's tons of impulse draw in red, but we've never had it trigger based on the amount of non-combat damage you can deal. So if you think about standard mono red, right now the 2 most popular burn spells, Play with Fire, Lightning Strike. As a burn spell, Empress Blaze is worse than those. It's 1 more mana than Play with Fire, it's 1 less damage than Lightning Strike, but the fact that you get an okay burn spell and then this really powerful enchantment, I think makes this a standard staple for mono red aggro style decks, because in the late game you get down the enchantment side and then all of a sudden your Play with Fires and Lightning Strikes and additional copies of Virtue of Courage turn into ridiculous sources of card advantage. They turn into light up the stages that are dealing damage, and one of the issues with mono red is you tend to dump your hand and run out of cards. This is a card that's okay enough in the early game, and then in the late game it's just going to turn any of your burn spells into a huge burst of card advantage to let you close out the game. Also worth pointing out, this works with any source of non-combat damage. So Thermo Alchemist taps to deal damage to each opponent. If you're playing 1v1, this taps to deal a damage and also draw you a card. If you're playing Commander, this hits each opponent will take a damage. That's 3 total damage. So Thermo Alchemist taps to draw 3 cards, which is kind of absurd. All will be 1, deals a ton of non-combat damage. Urbrus, when you cast an instant or sorcery, deals the damage to target opponent and you make a mana, so you can exile a card and use the mana to cast it. Any pinger that just taps to deal a damage is going to be really good. So there's actually a lot of ways to take advantage of this card. My first thought with this card was, this seems like a great card for Torbrand Commander decks, and I still think it could be an okay card, but there is something I wanted to point out here. If you look at Torbrand, the most common way to play Torbrand is kind of as a Punisher deck, where Torbrand adds 2 damage to your red sources, so you play these repeatable sources of damage like Burning Earth. Whenever a player taps a non-basic land for mana, it deals 1 damage to that player. If you have Torbrand, it's 3 damage, or like Spell Shock. Whenever a player casts a spell, they gotta take 2 damage. With Torbrand, it's 4 damage. So those are kind of the staples of a Torbrand deck. The thing is, the way Virtue of Courage is worded, you can only play the cards it exiles this turn, the turn that you're currently in. So that means exiling cards and damaging your your opponent during your opponent's turn is actually kind of sketchy. Like, your opponent is probably going to be tapping their lands most commonly during their turn, so they take a bunch of damage. You could exile a bunch of cards to Virtue of Courage, but unless they're instants, you're not going to be able to cast them. The good news is it is a May ability, so you can just choose not to actually exile any cards if you don't think you're going to be able to cast them. So all this to say, Virtue of Courage is going to be at its best in a deck that can damage your opponents repeatedly during your turn, and I think it still would work really well in Torbrand. Like, you can still kind of build Torbrand to work that way, but it seems even better with some other commanders. Like, it seems ridiculous with Niheb the Eternal. The way Niheb works, it wants you to deal a bunch of damage to your opponent during your pre-combat main phase or during combat, and then you can make a ridiculous amount of mana in the post-combat main phase. So I imagine you get down your Niheb and your Virtue of Courage and you like Earthquake or something and deal a bunch of damage and exile a ridiculous amount of cards, and then you can use the mana from Niheb to cast all the cards you exile, or maybe even better, Purphoros. So Purphoros, this is kind of like mind-blowing. Purphoros has an ability where whenever a creature ETBs under your control, it deals 2 damage to each opponent. So assuming you're playing Commander, you're going to be dealing 2 damage to 3 opponents. That's 6 total damage. So if you have Purphoros and Virtue of Courage, and you make a single creature, let's say you play a 1/1 creature, you're going to deal 6 damage. You can exile 6 cards and play them this turn, and then you probably get another cheap creature that you can play and deal 6 more damage and exile 6 more cards. You'll probably just draw through your entire deck. It's absolutely absurd. Also really good in Soul Foam, which just adds more to your non-combat damage. So it seems like a staple in any deck like that. If you're playing a commander deck that is built around dealing a bunch of non-combat damage, I think this card is kind of an auto-include and probably pretty busted. Of course, also good in Prosper, any like Cast from Exile. If that's your thing, Felden or Prosper, where you're intentionally trying to play cards from exile, this goes up even more in value. Works incredibly well with stuff like Pyrohemia, just 1 mana to deal 1 damage to each creature and player. So that means with a Virtue of Courage, it's essentially a repeatable red ancestral recall. You pay 1, you ping each of your opponents for 1, exile 3 cards, and you can do it again and do it again. Add in like a damage doubler like Dictate, or this is where Torbrand would be absurd, where you're paying 1 and exiling 9 cards and dealing 3 damage to everything. This is just such a ridiculous source of card advantage. So Virtue of Courage, I actually think this card is kind of ridiculous. I don't think it can make it in 60 card formats outside of Standard. I feel like this is going to be amazing in like Standard mono red decks. And I know people are going to say, well, 5 mana, that's a lot. That is true. It is a lot. But remember, this is really a okay 2 mana shock that as a bonus, just for fun, you get this enchantment for when the game goes long. So don't focus too much on the 5 mana part. Focus on the 2 mana part, with the 5 mana part being a bonus. So I think this is a standard staple for red aggro style decks, and I think this is going to be one of the most busted source of card advantage in mass non-combat damage commander decks like we were talking about. We also got a much less exciting card in Rankle's Prank. So Rankle's Prank, 4 mana sorcery, choose 1 or more. Each player discards 2 cards, each player loses 4 life, or each player sacks 2 creatures. So this card, obviously based on Rankle from original Eldraine, kind of has the same abilities. Each player discards, each player loses life. I guess original Rankle, you draw cards, each player sacrifices. So is this card actually worth it? On one hand, it does a lot for just 4 mana. If you add up all these modes, you're getting 2 cards discarded, 4 life lost, and 2 creatures sacked for 4 mana. That's actually a huge amount of value. The problem is, this is also hitting you, which is gonna make it tricky to use. Some of the modes you can kind of play around, like if you have no creatures, then each player sacking a creature is not really a downside. But the other modes, like losing life or discarding cards, are gonna be a little harder to play around. So I'm actually a little skeptical that this is a strong card. It reminds me the most of Fraying Omnipotence, which is 5 mana, each player loses half their life, discards half their cards, and sacrifices half their creatures rounded up. That was a card that really never saw any play, and I think the same is probably true for Rankle's Prank. I feel like yes, it can do a ton, but the fact that it hits you as well is going to make it really hard for most decks to use. On the other hand, I thought Invoke Despair was going to be bad, and Invoke Despair ended up being not just good, but like bannably good. So maybe I'm underrating this card, but again, Invoke Despair just wrecks your opponent. There's really no downside to it. You're either making your opponent sacrifice and lose a bunch of life or draw a bunch of cards. Rankle's Prank, the only way it is going to hurt your opponent is if it's also hurting you. So you're going to have to build a really, really specific deck to take advantage of it. That said, if you add up everything this does, each player discards 2 is probably like a 2 mana mana value spell. Each player loses 4 life, kind of like a Flame Rift essentially. Each player sacks 2 as like a Barter in Blood. You're getting a huge mana discount. Like if you added all these effects together, it's probably like 8 mana worth of spells, and you do have some flexibility. You can choose 1 or more modes. So if it's really bad to lose 4 life because you're almost dead or something, you can just choose not to use that mode. But all this to say, I think Rankle's Prank, it's a cool design. I like the callback to Rankle, but I think it's going to be too hard to use to actually be a competitive card. We also got a pretty interesting new red token producer in Song of Totentanz. So red next for a sorcery to make X/1/1 black-red creature tokens that can't block and creatures you control gain haste until end of turn. So this can make a massive rat army out of nowhere and maybe just kill your opponent by giving them haste. So this reminds me a little bit of Firecat Blitz, a super old card that was actually pretty good back in its day. Also worth mentioning, it gives all your creatures haste. So obviously the dream is you got like 10 mana and you make 9 rats and haste them up and kill your opponent, but you could theoretically just cast this for 1 mana, like a burst of speed, to give what you already played this turn that's not rats haste, to smash your opponent with something else. So there is some flexibility here. We have a couple of other X token producers in standard. Invasion Euphraxia, you gotta be 2 colors. It does make 2 2s, which is an upside, but it is a little more expensive. Ganjo Uprising, probably the worst of the bunch because you also give your opponent a bunch of tokens, though you do get haste. I think Song of Totentanz is worth noting just because it's the cheapest and it also gives haste. So if you're trying to go long and play knights, Invasion Euphraxia is going to be better, but this certainly has some upside in some sort of token deck. I'm envisioning this being a finisher with like Jetmir Nexus of Revels or Ginny Fae with Regal Bunnicorn thrown in. Like you just get down your Jetmir and you cast this and give all your things haste, and it's going to give you enough creatures to get all your modes of Jetmir, and all of a sudden these rats are actually like 4 power hasty double strike tramplers and your opponent just dies. All the rats are actually hasty dog tokens thanks to Ginny Fae, or your Regal Bunnicorn just becomes absolutely massive. So I think that's the main use of this card. I actually think like the rat text is kind of a trap, and it's not supposed to be like a rat tribal card. This is just a really good token producer. And remember, we're in a standard where there's a lot of things that want you to have fodder for sacrifice, and the rats, even though they can't block, they are great sacrifice fodder. So maybe you're trying to like flip your Elish Norn or casualty your Ob Nixilis or beseech the Mirror Bargain. These rats are going to be very useful there as well. It could work with actual rats. I'm skeptical that it's actually going to be a rat tribal card, but it is cute with Chromonics. Chromonics gives all your other rats toxic. So that means if you can make 10 rats and connect with all of them, you just win on the spot. It kind of gives your rats double strike thanks to the poison counters. So that could be a possibility. As far as actual rat decks in Commander, this card has one super huge problem, which is rats are pretty much all mono black. All the best rat commanders are mono black. So I don't think this is supposed to be a rat card. I think in Commander, the same is true as Standard, where this is mostly like a token card, where if you're trying to just add a ton of bodies to the battlefield, this actually has a lot of upside. That same Jetmir trick can just kill the table. It's cute with Gimli. Gimli wants stuff to die, so if you can sacrifice your rats, this is a good way to grow your Gimli. Kind of hilarious with like Perforos and Zada. I think that's the most unique part about this card, is outside of Firecat Blitz, there aren't really many red X spells that make X tokens. This is like a combo finisher for your Perforos deck, where Perforos is just 2 damage when a creature ETBs to each of your opponents. So you just make a bunch of mana and then like dump it all into Song and just burn the table out with Perforos. So it seems great. They're also hilarious with Zada. Sure, the rats can't block, but they are bodies on the battlefield that you can copy your spells on with Zada. So I think those are the homes for this. So don't focus too much on the rat text. Focus on, this is an efficient way that I can just add a ton of bodies to the battlefield to synergize with my token deck, to sacrifice for value, to burn with my Perforos, and that's going to be enough. Plus, giving your team haste is a nice bonus as well. So Song of Totentanz, I think, is actually a pretty good card. We'll have to see if the token deck develops in Standard. In some ways, Tokens reminds me of the infamous Graveyard deck. Every set, we get these cards, and I'm like, oh, Urborg Wargreif, this is going to be the time. Old Stick Fingers, this is going to be the set where it finally works. And I build the deck and it flops again. Tokens have been a little bit like that, where there's so many good pieces for a token deck, but because of the meta, because of the Farewells and the Sunfalls and so forth, it's been hard to actually make those decks work. But if tokens finally take off in Standard, I feel like Song is a really, really solid option that works with many of the best cards in the format and can just close out the game by surprise. Next up, we have one of the wordiest green removal spells of all time, Infinity Pharaoh Encounter. So this is a card that has an entire book worth of text on it, but I think it actually is going to play much simpler than it reads. So 2 mana green sorcery, double green mana, says look at the top 5 cards of your library. You can exile a creature card from among them, put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. You may cast the exiled card this turn. And then at the beginning of the next combat phase this turn, target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to up to 1 target creature you don't control. So this card, in that huge soup of words, what it actually is essentially Infectious Bite at sorcery speed, discounting the poison counter thing, but it's Infectious Bite. It's a bite spell where your creature deals damage to an opponent's creature. It's got this weird timing delay since it's a sorcery, so you play it during your pre-combat main phase, and then when you go to combat, it's gonna be a delayed trigger that'll trigger and let you do the Infectious Bite thing. And then it's also like a weird 2 mana Commune with Nature, where you get to grab a creature from your top 5, with the drawback being you can only use that creature this turn. So it's actually much more of a red spell than a green spell. So this card I think is actually pretty powerful. It's very flexible. In the early game, it's kind of a bad bite spell where it's bad removal. It's sorcery speed, so it's not as good as like Infectious Bite if it's just removal. But then later in the game, when you have extra mana, you can cast this and exile a creature and get some card advantage out of it as well. When this is a bite spell that is also drawing you a creature, then it becomes pretty powerful. So I think this is one of those cards that's kind of designed for best of one on Arena. It gives you that flexibility where it gives you some removal. It also gives you some card advantage, but I think it's pretty reasonable. Probably the biggest issue with this card though is it's mono green and double green, and green just hasn't been a good color. So if a mono green deck develops, this could be very strong in it, but we just haven't seen that in Standard. The weirdest part of this card by far to me is it's essentially Impulse Draw in green, and maybe I've missed something, but I tried to look back and see. As far as I know, green has never had red style Impulse Draw. Red gets tons of cards that are like exile a card, you can play it this turn. I'm pretty sure this is the first ever green card that can do that. I'm not exactly sure why they worded it that way, why it didn't just put the creature in your hand. I guess maybe that would be too strong. If this was 2 mana fight your thing or bite your thing, and then also just draw a card, that would probably be too good, and you'd have to up the mana cost. So it's definitely a very, very weird design. In some ways, it feels pretty color pie breaking. But as I said before, if a green deck develops in Standard, I like this card. It's fine removal early, and then it's fine card draw plus removal late in the game. And one thing green has going for it is it does have a lot of big creatures. And remember, this is a bite spell rather than a fight spell. So your creature just damages your opponent's creature. Your creature doesn't take any damage, which is better than a fight spell. So if we see a green deck develop, or maybe a Golgari deck with Mosswood Dread Knight, I could see this being a pretty good removal slash weird late game cantrip option for a deck like that. We also got a card that I think is kind of ridiculous in Regal Bunnicorn. So Regal Bunnicorn, as silly as the card is and looks and is named, I think it's actually very powerful. So 2 mana, its power and toughness is equal to the number of non-land permanents you control. So by itself, this card, obviously horrible. It's a 2 mana 1/1. The thing is, this scales ridiculously. Normally in Magic, it costs 3 mana to get a creature that has power and toughness equal to the number of creatures you control or artifacts you control. Regal Bunnicorn is only 2 mana, and it's any non-land permanent. And what this means is it's going to grow based on tokens on the battlefield along with creatures and everything else. So your Charming Scoundrel coming into play and making a treasure, or a Wicked Roll, is adding 2 permanents to the battlefield, which is 2 power and toughness to Regal Bunnicorn. Your Blood Tithe Harvester adds a creature in a blood token that's plus 2 power and toughness to Regal Bunnicorn. So this means Regal Bunnicorn just gets really, really big, really fast. If your deck is based on putting treasures or bloods or even creatures or tokens, whatever on the battlefield, this is just going to be an absolutely massive 2-drop. The only downside I would say of this card is it can be weak off the top in the late game. So if your board gets Wrath and you get Farewelled and this is your next draw step, it's just going to be a 1/1, which is kind of sad. But imagine some sort of token deck in Standard where you're playing Join the Dances and Wedding Announcements. Regal Bunnicorn's just going to get massive super quick. trick. So yes, it doesn't have an ETB. Yes, it has to untap, but I think this is a card that can just get so big that it's gonna be worth it anyway. Once you go back to older formats, there's some powerful cards that work really well with this. I was imagining like Seasoned Pyromancer might be my favorite. Turn 2 your Bunnicorn, turn 3 Pyromancer, filter through your deck, draw some cards, make some elementals. Just that by itself is gonna make Bunnicorn a 4/4, and then it's gonna keep growing throughout the game, and that's assuming you don't even have a 1-dropper. Fable the Mirror Breaker makes the token, it's an enchantment, the token's gonna make treasures, so it just adds so many permanents to the battlefield. So I actually think this could be a card that has a shot even outside of Standard. In Standard, obviously, it's just going to be really big. I'm super hyped to try this in a roll deck, in a token deck. I think this could be a staple level 2-drop in the right deck. And outside of Standard, I think there also could be decks to take advantage of this. It's another card that seems built for Kadria, Cholera the Small. It's been a very good set for Kadria of all things. It's a rabbit. It cares about having tons of permanents on the battlefield. But I think this could be good in any token style commander deck. Maybe you're playing Mondrak and you're making a bunch of creature tokens, but you're also playing Smothering Tithe because you're a mono white deck and that's just a mono white staple. The treasures are growing your Regal Bunnicorn. The tokens that you make that are creatures are drawing your Mondrak. Any planeswalkers you play, any artifacts or enchantments, your mana rocks are growing it. This card just gets really, really big, really, really fast. So yes, it's a kind of French vanilla creature, has no abilities, no ETBs, it doesn't have face, it doesn't draw you a card, but I think there has to be room, even in 2023, for a 2-drop that's just really, really big. So I actually have pretty high hopes that Regal Bunnicorn might not be a meme. It might not just be a commander card. I think this might be a legit constructed card just based on the pure stats it can add to the battlefield. We also got a black adventure creature, which might be pretty strong, in Gumdrop Poisoner. So adventure side, 1 mana instant makes a food token. Creature side, 3 mana black human warlock with lifelink. When it ETBs, target creature gets -X until end of turn, where X is the amount of life you gain this turn. So this can be kind of a self-contained removal spell where you like pay 1 to make the food, pay 2 to sack the food, which gains you 3 life, then you pay 3 to play the poisoner, give something -3, get a 3/2 lifelinker. If you think about what this card is, it's kind of like Curious Pair adventure mode, but upgraded since it's instant speed, mixed with, I guess, Nightmare Thirst is removal on a relatively decent 3/2 lifelinking body. So what Gumdrop Poisoner really wants, I think, is a card that just incidentally gains life every turn and works in black decks. Do we have anything like that in Standard, perhaps? Honestly, it seems kind of busted with Shieldred, right? Like, Shieldred just sits out, you're drawing cards on your upkeep to gain life. Maybe you're playing Phyrexian Arena or additional card draw to gain even more life. Plus, your black decks are probably playing Phyrexian Flesh Scorcher, Graveyard Trespasser that gain life. Gumdrop Poisoner also has lifelink to gain life. Doesn't this just seem like kind of a ridiculous card in some sort of Shieldred deck? Like, it seems pretty easy to build your deck in a way where this is just like a 3 mana Ravenous Chupacabra that comes down, snipes things, and leaves an even better body on the battlefield. So I actually think this card is designed to be really good in constructed. Yes, you gotta have a plan for gaining life, but if you have a plan for gaining life, this is a very, very efficient removal spell on a creature. We also see people sometimes play actual life gain decks in Standard, like Voice of the Blessed still exists, Lunarch Veteran, Elias Elcor, which are just gaining life as creatures come into play. Maybe we see someone try an actual life gain deck. It also works in food decks. I don't really like the food plan. Like, it's just so much mana to sack a food to gain life. But still, like, in the late game, when you got a bunch of mana, you got nothing going on, sacking 2 or 3 foods and then casting this with all your mana to kill something big, that does seem realistic. Outside of Standard, could be good in Soul Sisters. I expect we'll see this on Arena and Soul Sisters at least. You see the Arena Soul Sisters decks. Arena players just love it, that are gaining tons of life. You got Collected Company. This you can hit off of Collected Company. The food token is another way to gain some life, so maybe it shows up there as well. So I think Gumdrop Poisoner, actually just a really good card. I think this could be very strong in Standard because of Shieldred and even outside of Shieldred in a life gain shell. And I think at 3 mana as a 3/2 lifelinker, it could show up outside of Standard, at least in like Explorer / Pioneer / Historic, as just a really efficient removal threat that can kind of stabilize the board with its lifelink. As far as lower rarity cards, just a couple worth mentioning today. Dream Spoilers, 4 mana 2/2 Fairy Warlock with flying. Whenever you cast a spell during an opponent's turn, up to one target creature an opponent controls gets -1/-1 until end of turn. I don't think this card is especially good. I mean, I guess you can play it in a fairy deck that you're playing a bunch of counters at instant speed or flash creatures to kill small things, but it is notable because it's essentially a functional reprint of Dream Spoiler Witches, which was a common from back in the Lorwyn days. It did something very similar. I guess it's a fairy warlock instead of a fairy wizard. Otherwise, it's essentially the exact same card. We also got Witchstalker Frenzy, which I can't help but think might actually be a really important removal spell in Standard. So 4 mana instant, but it costs 1 less to cast for each creature that attack this turn. Worth mentioning, it doesn't say your creature. So if your opponent attacks with a bunch of creatures, you get the discount, or you can do it during your turn. And then Witchstalker Frenzy deals 5 damage to target creature. So 5 damage is like the magic number for red decks in Standard, because that's the amount of damage that gets Shieldred off the battlefield. And I think this might just be the new best way to kill Shieldred for a red deck. We have some 3 mana cards that kill Shieldred in your mono red deck. This is technically 4, but I think because of the discount, it should be pretty easy for your red deck to set up a scenario where you like attack with a bunch of random red things and cast this for just 1 mana before blocks are declared to get Shieldred off the battlefield. Worst case seems like a sideboard staple. It doesn't hit your opponent's face, which is something red decks care about. But worst case, I think sideboard staple for red aggro decks to deal with Shieldred. Best case, it might actually be main deckable to deal with Shieldred. We also got a pretty cute little value-y creature in Woodland Acolyte. So this is an uncommon Selesnya adventure. It's spell side, 1 mana instant, put target permanent card from your graveyard on top of your library. And then it's creature side, 3 mana 2/2, when it ETBs, you draw a card, and it's a human cleric. So this is essentially like a bad reclaim, because it only hits permanent, so you can't put spells back. And also like a Priest of Ancient Lore style effect. I think those two things being combined together actually makes for a cool little value card. Like, the best home for this is probably some sort of Panharmonicon deck, where this can get back your Elishnorn or Panharmonicon that gets killed, because your opponent's always going to try to kill those. That's how it goes if you play a Panharmonicon deck. But then also ETBs, double triggers, draw a couple of cards. So I could see this actually being a pretty sweet option for some of those white decks in Standard. We've seen like Spirited Companion just be a staple in white decks in Standard, just because it kind of grinds you out, generates some value, puts a body on the battlefield. Maybe you got an Elishnorn, and then maybe you recast it later in the game with Sarah's Paragon or whatever. So I feel like Woodland Acolyte offers enough little sneaky bits of value that it could show up in a role similar to that. Otherwise, there's a couple of other random uncommons that you can check out over on MTGPreviews.com. So anyway, that brings us to the end of our daily Wilds of Eldraine spoilers for today. So we're almost to the end of spoiler season, honestly. As far as I can tell, we have a single Mythic left, which I think is the green virtue we haven't seen yet. And there might be like 1 or 2 rares. We get the full spoiler dump on Friday, so probably no spoiler video tomorrow, but I'll come back Friday, see whatever the rest of the cards are in the full spoiler dump, and wrap things up. Also worth mentioning, today is Commander Precon Spoiler Day. Tomer's going to be covering those on the MTGGoldfish Commander YouTube, so head over there, check out his videos, see all the sweet new Commander cards. Anyway, thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll be back on Friday with 1 more spoiler video to wrap up the set. So until then, have an amazing day, and I will talk to you soon. Looking for even more magic? Well, check out the video where we tried to see if you could win on Arena with a 0 rare budget with the help of Shrapnel Blast, or maybe the one where we talked about the most expensive card from every year of Magic the Gathering.